Okay, so you probably think you already know the story of Rocky Dennis. Most people do. They remember the unforgettable face, the emotional Hollywood movie mask, Cher's powerful performance as his tough biker mother, and a heartbreaking tale about a boy who refused to let a devastating illness define him. For decades, that version has become the story everyone remembers. But what if that famous movie only revealed part of the truth? What if the real people behind it lived lives that were far more complicated, far more painful, and in many ways far more extraordinary than Hollywood ever dared to show? Because before there was an award-winning film, before audiences around the world cried in movie theaters, there was a real family struggling through a nightmare that almost nobody could imagine. And before her death, Rocky's mother, Florence "Rusty" Tullis Dennis, spoke openly about her son, her own mistakes, the movie that made them famous, and the parts of the story that had been softened, altered, or left out entirely. Her words painted a picture that was both inspiring and uncomfortable, a reminder that real life rarely fits neatly into a Hollywood script. To understand everything that happened, we have to go back to the very beginning. Roy Lee Dennis entered the world on December 4, 1961, in Glendora, California. Almost immediately, his family noticed that he was different from other babies. He was nicknamed Rocky because he refused to fall asleep unless someone gently rocked him. At first, his childhood seemed relatively normal, aside from frequent ear infections and sinus problems that doctors treated as ordinary illnesses. Nothing suggested that his life would become one of the most remarkable medical stories ever recorded. Everything changed after what should have been a routine operation. When Rocky was just 2 years old, doctors prepared him for a simple tonsillectomy. During the examination, an X-ray technician noticed something unusual about the shape of his skull. That unexpected discovery led to months of testing at UCLA Medical Center. Week after week, Rusty carried her young son to appointments, hoping for answers while fearing the worst. Eventually, those answers came. Doctors diagnosed Rocky with craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, an incredibly rare genetic disorder that caused excessive bone growth throughout the skull and face. The disease slowly thickened the bones surrounding the brain, compressed important nerves, and threatened to destroy his eyesight, hearing, and eventually his life. The diagnosis shocked even experienced specialists. At the time, doctors reportedly believed only a handful of cases had ever been documented worldwide. They warned Rusty that her son would likely lose his vision, suffer severe developmental problems, and almost certainly die before reaching his 7th birthday. Imagine hearing those words as a parent. Most people would have been overwhelmed by grief. Many would have accepted the medical predictions as unavoidable. Rusty Dennis refused to do either. Instead, she decided the doctors were wrong. Whether driven by hope, stubbornness, or sheer determination, she refused to raise Rocky as someone waiting to die. She believed that if people constantly treated him like a victim, he would become one. Instead, she insisted he attend regular schools, make friends, and experience as much of life as possible. That decision would shape everything that followed. School officials often questioned whether Rocky belonged in mainstream classrooms. Some believed his physical appearance and medical condition would make learning impossible. Rusty fought every attempt to isolate him. She insisted her son was intelligent, capable, and deserved exactly the same opportunities as everyone else. Time would prove her right. Despite enormous challenges, Rocky became known not for his appearance but for his kindness, intelligence, and remarkable sense of humor. People who spent time with him often forgot about his condition within minutes because his personality completely overshadowed the way he looked. One of those people was screenwriter Anna Hamilton Phelan. When she met Rocky during research at UCLA, she expected to encounter tragedy. Instead, she found an optimistic teenager who laughed easily, treated others with warmth, and possessed a confidence that seemed almost impossible considering everything he faced. That meeting would eventually inspire the film Mask. But before Hollywood arrived, there was another remarkable figure at the center of Rocky's life. His mother. The woman audiences saw portrayed by Cher was based on reality, but only partly. Florence "Rusty" Tullis Dennis had lived an extraordinary life long before Rocky's diagnosis. Born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1936, she grew up with a rebellious streak that seemed impossible to contain. She skipped school regularly, eventually dropped out, experimented with drugs while still a teenager, and became involved with motorcycle clubs years before most women would have considered entering that world. She worked as a dancer, married young, became a mother, divorced, remarried, and eventually moved to California, where Rocky was born. Nothing about her life fit traditional expectations. Rusty never claimed to be a perfect mother. In fact, she openly admitted she enjoyed partying and using drugs during parts of her life. Unlike the film, which often suggested her addiction was rooted mainly in emotional pain, Rusty later insisted that drugs were simply part of the biker lifestyle she embraced. She never tried to rewrite her past or make excuses for it. She owned every part of who she was. Yet alongside that rough lifestyle existed another side of Rusty that surprised many people. She fiercely defended Rocky against anyone who underestimated him. She challenged doctors. She challenged teachers. She challenged neighbors who stared. She refused to allow strangers to define her son by his appearance. One belief guided nearly everything she did. Rusty believed the human mind possessed incredible healing power. She often said that if people could make themselves sick, perhaps they could also help make themselves well. Whenever Rocky suffered painful headaches, she encouraged him to retreat to his room, rest, and believe he could overcome the pain. Today, that philosophy remains controversial. Some see it as empowering. Others believe it minimized the seriousness of Rocky's illness. Rusty never changed her mind. She maintained that believing in strength allowed Rocky to live far longer than doctors expected and prevented him from seeing himself as someone simply waiting for death. Meanwhile, Rocky grew surrounded by an unusual but deeply loyal extended family. Many members of Rusty's motorcycle community embraced him completely. The bikers shown in Mask were not fictional inventions. They were inspired by real people who accepted Rocky without judgment and became a constant source of love and support. Their appearance often frightened outsiders. Their kindness surprised almost everyone. When Hollywood eventually adapted the story, audiences fell in love with the emotional relationship between Rocky and his mother. Yet Rusty herself later admitted the movie wasn't entirely accurate. She described it as something unexpected. A fairy tale. Not because she disliked it, but because it transformed reality into something cleaner and easier for audiences to understand. Released in 1985, Mask became both a critical and commercial success. Directed by Peter Bogdanovich, starring Cher and Eric Stoltz, the film earned widespread praise and brought Rocky's story to millions of people. The movie grossed more than $48 million at the box office. Rusty reportedly received only around $15,000 for the rights to her family's story. Even that money didn't stay with her. Much of it went toward helping pay medical expenses for her older son, Joshua Mason, who was battling AIDS during one of the darkest periods of the epidemic. In other words, Rusty wasn't trying to profit from tragedy. She was desperately trying to save another child. When journalists interviewed her after the film's release, many expected endless praise for Hollywood. Instead, they received honesty. Rusty explained that she originally believed the movie would focus almost entirely on Rocky's courage. Instead, audiences became equally fascinated by her own unconventional personality. Thanks to Cher's acclaimed performance, Rusty suddenly found herself transformed into one of the film's main attractions. She appreciated Cher's portrayal. She simply hadn't expected the spotlight to shift. She even joked that she'd always considered herself perfectly normal while believing everyone else was crazy. That line captured her personality better than almost anything else she ever said. Still, several important parts of the real story never appeared on screen. One of the biggest omissions involved Joshua, Rocky's older brother. He was removed entirely from the movie despite playing a significant role within the family. Rusty later admitted that omission deeply disappointed her. Another difference involved the film's music. Rocky had reportedly loved Bruce Springsteen. Director Peter Bogdanovich originally built much of the soundtrack around Springsteen's songs. Licensing problems eventually forced the studio to replace them with Bob Seger tracks without the director's approval. Rusty publicly criticized the decision. She simply remarked that Rocky probably didn't even know who Bob Seger was. Sometimes a single sentence says everything. As the years passed, Rocky's health slowly deteriorated. Although doctors once believed he would never reach his 7th birthday, he continued defying expectations until he was 16 years old. Eventually, however, the disease began winning. The headaches became unbearable. His mobility declined. He spent increasing amounts of time in a wheelchair. One evening in late September 1978, family members gathered for dinner. Everyone noticed how weak Rocky had become. Later that night, suffering from another severe headache, he returned home. Rusty responded exactly as she always had. She encouraged him to rest and told him to make himself well. It was something she had repeated throughout his entire childhood. The next morning, Rocky never woke up. He died peacefully in his sleep at just 16 years old, nearly a full decade longer than doctors had ever believed possible. Hollywood portrayed Rusty discovering his body herself. Reality was different. At the time of Rocky's death, she was reportedly meeting with her lawyer regarding legal troubles connected to drug possession. Her longtime partner called to tell her the devastating news. It was another reminder that real life is often far messier than cinema. Rusty never publicly expressed regret for the philosophy that had guided Rocky's upbringing. She believed until the end that refusing to let him see himself as helpless gave him something priceless: hope. After Rocky's death, another heartbreaking chapter unfolded. Joshua, the son almost entirely erased from Mask, was diagnosed with AIDS-related illness during the 1980s. Rusty devoted herself to supporting him just as fiercely as she had supported Rocky. Joshua died in 1987. Within less than 10 years, Rusty had buried both of her sons. Despite unimaginable loss, she continued rebuilding her life. She became involved in counseling people struggling with addiction, embraced Buddhism, and worked with organizations supporting terminally ill patients. Friends noticed that while she remained unmistakably Rusty, still riding motorcycles and living life on her own terms, she also seemed determined to help others facing despair. Then tragedy struck one final time. In October 2006, while riding her three-wheeled motorcycle in California, Rusty suffered a terrible accident after a tire reportedly came off the vehicle. She survived the initial crash despite serious injuries, including broken legs and a punctured lung. But complications followed. An infection developed. On November 11, 2006, Florence "Rusty" Tullis Dennis died at the age of 70. Even in her final years, she never abandoned the beliefs that had defined her entire life. She spoke about death not as an ending but as another destination, saying Rocky had always loved going places. She insisted she never asked, "Why me?" after losing either of her sons. That refusal to surrender, to despair, to regret, or to self-pity, remained one of her defining characteristics until the very end. So what should we remember today? Not simply the movie. Not only the heartbreaking photographs. Not just the extraordinary medical condition. Remember the real Rocky Dennis, a bright, funny teenager who became an honor student, tutored classmates, memorized constellations, formed deep friendships, and refused to believe his appearance determined his worth. And remember his mother, a flawed, unconventional, fiercely loyal woman who challenged doctors, battled prejudice, loved her sons with absolute intensity, and lived according to rules entirely her own. Neither of them fit comfortably into the kind of inspirational story Hollywood prefers. They were more complicated than that. More human. More unforgettable. Perhaps that's why, decades later, people still find themselves returning to Rocky Dennis's story, not because it offers perfect heroes or simple answers, but because it reminds us that courage often appears in the most unexpected places, carried by ordinary people who refuse to accept the limits the world places upon them. Sometimes the truth is messier than the movie. And sometimes, that truth is even more powerful.